Welcome to Black History Matters 2022, presented by the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum, also known as NAHOF, located in Peterborough, New York. Black History Matters is an educational series that seeks to highlight historical events in the Black American experience. This series consists of 28 videos that NAHOF will release daily through the month of February 2022. Videos are viewable on NAHOF's website. The mission of the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum is to honor anti-slavery abolitionists, their work to end slavery and the legacy of that struggle, and strive to complete the second and ongoing abolition, the moral conviction to end racism. This program was funded in part by Humanities New York with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Joanna Jimenez. Joanna graduated from the University of Texas at Austin in 2019 with bachelor's degrees in government, history, and African diaspora studies. She also recently graduated with a master's degree in public administration. She has most recently worked as a grant writer for various nonprofit organizations. Joanna particularly enjoyed working with the nonprofit Grassroots Leadership in Austin, Texas. This organization is dedicated to the decriminalization of immigrant communities. In the future, she seeks to pursue a doctorate in the field of international relations with the goal of helping underrepresented communities on a global scale. I'd like to now invite Joanna to begin her presentation.
Hello, my name is Joanna Jimenez, and today I will be presenting on intersectionality, specifically the intersecting identities of Black women. So first, before I get into it, I'd like to just speak about the meaning of intersectionality. Intersectionality is when multiple marginalized identities combine to create a unique form of discrimination. For example, Black feminist group the Can Be River Collective spoke about the intersection of being gay, Black, and a woman. These intersecting identities are each treated with prejudice, but together, a person with these identities can face even harsher discrimination. Kimberly Crenshaw also explained this phenomenon by calling intersectionality a way to describe the convergence of identities. This convergence then results in obstacles not typically understood by a conventional society, but rather within these marginalized groups. Other convergences can be found through examples such as gendered racism, which deals with the intersection of race and gender. The focus of this presentation will be on the marginalization of Black women in society due to the intersectionality of gender and race. It is important to note that recognizing the intersectionality of gender and race with relevance to Black women does not discount the ways in which intersectionality affects others. As discussed earlier, gendered racism affects men as well as women. Gendered racism creates negative social stigma associated with men and women of a certain racial background. For these reasons, Black men are seen especially vulnerable to the negative ramifications of gendered racism. Historically, Black men have dealt with the stigmas associated with their identities being perceived as violent and dangerous. This has resulted in various injustices being committed against these individuals. Moreover, intersectionality reaches across a number of identities, such as gender, race, class, sexual orientation, physical ability, etc. And so intersectionality in many ways functions as the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and oppression. This presentation will focus on intersectionality of gender and race with regards to Black women, as this group has in many ways pushed the conversation of intersectionality to the forefront. Firstly, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of intersectionality. Intersectionality in the field of social sciences is a framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. The term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. Intersectionality identifies multiple factors of advantage and disadvantage within these identities. Now, there are many identities that make up a person. Examples of these factors include gender, caste, sex, race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, religion, disability, weight, physical appearance, and type. These intersecting and overlapping social identities can be both empowering and oppressing, depending on societal perception. Intersectionality was developed in the late 20th century, originally as a means to identify how interlocking systems of power affect those who are most marginalized in society. Activists use this framework to promote social and political egalitarianism. An important component of intersectionality is that it opposes systems that treat each axis of oppression in isolation, as if discrimination against Black women could be explained as simply misogyny or simply racism. For example, Crenshaw has pointed to the 1976 case of de Graffenried versus General Motors. In this case, the plaintiffs alleged hiring practice that specifically discriminated against Black women. These hiring practices cannot be described as either racial discrimination or sex discrimination alone. Throughout history, intersectionality has broadened the lenses of the first and second waves of feminism, which largely focused on the experiences of women who are both white and middle class. Intersectionality has broadened the scope to include the different experiences of women of color, women who are poor, immigrant women, and or other groups. Intersectional feminism aims to separate itself from white feminism by acknowledging women's different experiences and identities. Now, there needs to be mention of the criticism intersectionality has faced within academia in recent years. Criticism of the framework deals with its tendency to reduce individuals to specific demographic factors. Critics have characterized the framework as ambiguous and lacking defined goals. However, I believe it is important to note that ideas behind intersectional feminism existed long before the term was coined. In 1851, Sojourner Truth gave a speech entitled Ain't I a Woman? In this speech, she spoke from her racialized position as a former slave to critique essentialist notions of femininity. In an 1892 essay, The Colored Woman's Office, Anna Julia Cooper identifies Black women as the most important actors in social change movements because of their experience with multiple facets of oppression. Patricia Hill Collins noted that as second wave feminism receded in the 1980s, feminists of color such as Audre Lorde, Gloria E. Anzaldúa, and Angela Davis entered academic environments and brought their perspectives to the scholarship. During this decade, many of the ideas that would together be labeled as intersectionality coalesced in US academia under a title we may be more familiar with nowadays: race, class, and gender studies. As I briefly mentioned earlier, a writer who focused on intersectionality was Audre Lorde. Lorde expressed her multifaceted personhood openly and demonstrated her intersectional struggles with being a Black gay woman. Lorde commented in her essay, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, that she was living in a country where racism, sexism, and homophobia are inseparable. Here, Lorde outlines the importance of intersectionality while also acknowledging that different prejudices are inherently linked. Lorde's formulation of this linkage remains seminal in intersectional feminism. Another important group that must be spoken about with relation to the history of intersectionality is the Kembe River Collective. The CRC was a radical Black feminist group that existed as an alternative to mainstream Black feminist groups. They talked about class, oppression, and many of the conversations surrounding race that we discuss normally nowadays, but were thought of as very radical during the 1970s. The CRC's goal was to help other groups understand how their different oppressions could be connected. The CRC named themselves after the Kembe River Raid, led by Harriet Tubman. This group believed that Black women's experience shaped their political outlook. An example of this can be found when Black women focus on reproductive justice, such as the right to bring children into the world and have them live safely. Additionally, Black women may fight against sterilization campaigns that disproportionately affect women of color, rather than simply fighting for abortion rights. In modern contexts, intersectionality has been seen in different lights. In 2012, the book How We Get Free by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor speaks on the lack of attention to intersectionality with regard to systemic change. Taylor argues that being a Black woman in a society is a societally disadvantageous position. The intersection of these identities results in discrimination based on race and sex. An argument that she presented stated that Black women receive 64 cents to the dollar that white men make. Often the media focuses on the wage gap of women, but in doing so, it can neglect to mention the even more substandard wage of Black women. Nowadays, intersectionality is considered crucial to social equity work. Activists and community organizations are called for and participate in more dynamic conversations about the differences in experience among people with different overlapping identities. Without an intersectional lens, events and movements that aim to address injustice towards one group may end up perpetuating systems of inequality towards other groups. Intersectionality encourages nuanced conversations and enlightens us to the disparities among women of color and is crucial to advocacy work. So what are the implications of intersectionality? Well, thinking of intersectionality in terms of interlocking oppression means that multiple oppressions compound to create new categories of oppression. As in, Black women can't only explain their oppression solely due to homophobia or misogyny or anything like that. It's because it's not just about multiple identities, it's about oppression related to these categories and how these oppressions interact to create not only a new category of experience, but different suffering than someone who belonged to only one of these groups would experience. The intersection of being a Black woman leads to a specific form of oppression that faces the brunt of discrimination through multiple avenues. In order to understand the implications of intersectionality, it's important to go beyond the grievances of singular identities, but instead analyze race and class as well as sex. By doing so, you can fully get an idea of the disadvantages of each person. The mere recognition of intersectionality would allow for greater support for these individuals who get overshadowed by broader issues. Now, in a practical perspective, intersectionality affects various facets of the way Black women interact in the workspace. I would like to show you the following charts to depict this perspective. Here, in this chart, you can see that the wage gap is depicted. The wage gap is perhaps the most direct way of viewing the differences in the wages between white men and women. One of the biggest disparities, as demonstrated in this chart, is that of Black women to their male counterparts. This chart only shows the gender pay gap between men and women who have a bachelor's degree. The controlled versus uncontrolled gender pay gap demonstrates the differences in the measures of pay for men and women in the same positions and the difference between men and women's median salary generally to the dollar. As you can see, there is a large disparity. In this next chart, I'd like to show you another one of the major issues in which women of color are disproportionately affected: the lack of professional development. As you can see, this chart depicts the representation of the corporate pipeline by gender and race. In the VP, SVP, and C-suite positions, there is a disproportionate amount of white men represented. In upper corporate positions, white men can be seen as represented at about 68%, whilst women of color are only represented 4% of the time. Lastly, I think it's also worth mentioning that there are many issues with hiring discrimination and higher turnover rates for Black women, and in this way, they're being unequitably affected. A survey was conducted in which the percentage of employees who experienced the following scenarios during the normal course of business was collected. Black women experience higher levels of relatability to the questions of, has your judgment been questioned in your area of expertise? Have you needed to provide more evidence of your competence than others do? And have you been addressed in a less than professional way? So what do we know from this information? Well, it means that Black women and women of color are dealing with significantly higher levels of professional discrimination than their male counterparts, especially their male white counterparts. And this way, we can statistically see that individuals with compounding marginalized identities are facing oppression on an institutional level. So you may be hearing this and thinking, what can we do? Well, on an individual level, solidarity is important. Often racial divisions and ideologies of freedom are divisive. In order to better be allies for those that are discriminated against due to their intersecting identities, one must recognize how difficult it is in the first place to obtain solidarity. The book Making Solidarity Uneasy cautions on a keyword from Black Lives Matter to the Past by David Roediger describes this difficulty in achieving solidarity. Often the commitment to an idea is challenging. It can be polarizing and ultimately takes time and dedication. Solidarity is necessary, however, because it creates a group of people who are unified in a fight. This group is stronger than the individual and creates a much more positive and loving environment for everyone involved. Barbara Ransby believed that one should always love their people and struggle alongside them. She believed that aligning yourself with those on the margins makes you the center of an important struggle. Today, most diversity and inclusion efforts include equity as a dimension, giving everyone equal opportunities to develop, considering their background and the unique challenges they face. To make sure that no one is left behind, companies need to collect and analyze data on pay and employment engagement, and also separating variables such as race, gender, and sexual orientation, or even physical ability. Targets for diversity and inclusion programs must include gender representation, but also racial inclusion at different levels of the organization. And any unconscious bias training must be designed with intersectionality in mind. These efforts aligned with continuous recognition of the struggles of compounding identities can help marginalized individuals prosper in a system that has historically been unjust. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you, Joanna, for your contribution of this presentation. Please help us by completing a brief survey available at the link on your screen and also in the video description box. Your feedback will help NAHOF receive funding and help plan future projects. Additionally, please contact NAHOF with any questions and if you're interested in learning more about the organization and its work. Once again, thank you, Joanna, for donating your time and contributing to this program. And thank you, the audience, for joining us on this educational journey, Black History Matters. We hope to see you at our next presentation.